Imagine this. You're at the beach, right? Bright, sunny St. Patrick's Day.
Oh, yeah.
Families are out. Kids are playing. Everyone's enjoying the warmth and the festive atmosphere.
Right.
It's the kind of day that should be etched in your memory for all the right reasons.
Yeah.
But for the Hurley family, March 17th, 1990 became a day etched in tragedy.
All right.
That's the day 14-year-old Rachel Hurley vanished from that very beach in Jupiter, Florida, leaving behind a mystery that continues to haunt the town to this day.
It's a case that really underscores the fragility of life and how quickly a day of celebration can turn into a nightmare.
Yeah.
The idyllic setting, the holiday atmosphere, it all makes the tragedy even more stark.
And that's what we're diving into today, the unsolved murder of Rachel Hurley.
Okay.
We'll be using the Crime Junkie podcast episode dedicated to Rachel's case as our guide. We're going to be piecing together the events, the evidence, and the twists and turns that have kept Rachel's family searching for answers for over 3 decades. So get ready to explore a real-life mystery that is as baffling as it is heartbreaking.
Sounds intriguing. Let's start by transporting ourselves back to that day, March 17th, 1990. Picture Jupiter, Florida, beautiful beaches, the sun shining, the air is filled with the carefree spirit of a holiday weekend.
Right.
But beneath that surface, a dark secret was about to unfold.
So Rachel was spending the day, as many teenagers might, enjoying a boat trip with some friends. Later that afternoon, she was supposed to meet her mom, Andrea, at Carlin Park.
Okay.
It was a simple plan, but Rachel never made it to that meeting point.
And that's when the worry starts to creep in, right? You're expecting your daughter, and she's not where she's supposed to be. It's every parent's worst fear.
Absolutely. And in Rachel's case, it wasn't like her to just disappear.
Right.
She was known for being responsible, especially when it came to her commitments. She and her mom were supposed to sell tickets that afternoon for a pancake breakfast fundraiser for her softball team, something Rachel wouldn't have missed willingly.
Yeah, it quickly became clear that something was terribly wrong.
Right.
A massive search effort was launched involving law enforcement, family, friends, and even volunteers from the community.
Wow.
Imagine combing through those beaches, those wooded areas, desperately hoping for any sign of Rachel.
It's a truly heartbreaking image. And what makes it even more tragic is that the person who eventually found Rachel's body was the father of one of her friends, a volunteer who was just trying to help.
Oh my God.
Can you imagine the emotional toll that must have taken?
Unimaginable. He was simply trying to do the right thing, to bring a friend's daughter home, to be confronted with that kind of tragedy. It's just devastating.
The location where her body was found adds another layer of complexity to this case. Where exactly was she discovered?
In a wooded area quite close to Carlin Park, tragically close to both the beach where she was last seen and the parking lot where she was supposed to meet her mom.
Oh, wow.
Raises so many questions. Was she taken from the beach? Was she led there? Was someone watching, waiting for an opportunity? It's chilling to think about.
Definitely. And it makes you wonder about the evidence found at the crime scene. What did the investigators uncover?
Well, there were several items that immediately caught their attention. They found a hairbrush that seemed to belong to a teenage girl, hair matching Rachel's color.
Okay.
And they also discovered a number of cigarette butts scattered near the scene.
You would think those cigarette butts might hold a valuable clue, right? Maybe a DNA sample, something to point them in the right direction.
Initially, they thought so too. But remember, this was 1990. DNA technology was in its infancy and not nearly as advanced as it is today.
Right.
And as it turned out, the cigarette butts presented a bit of a false lead.
How so?
Well, the volunteer who discovered Rachel's body admitted that he had been smoking while waiting for the police to arrive.
Oh, wow.
He'd been understandably traumatized by the discovery and needed a way to cope. It meant those cigarette butts couldn't be definitively linked to the perpetrator.
Okay, so a bit of a red herring there. What about Rachel's belongings? Was anything else found at the scene?
Yes, investigators recovered some of Rachel's clothing near where her body was found. They found her t-shirt, her bathing suit, and her gym shorts, all discarded.
Okay.
And the condition of the clothing, along with the wounds on Rachel's body, suggested that there had been a struggle, that this poor girl had fought for her life.
It's a truly horrifying thought. A young girl facing such a terrifying situation. And I understand there was something else, something found in a burn barrel nearby. What was that about?
Yes, that's right. In a burn barrel just a short distance from Rachel's body, investigators found a bloody shirt.
Okay.
This became a key piece of evidence, and we'll delve into why it was so crucial a little later.
So we have the scene, we have some initial evidence. What did the autopsy reveal about Rachel's cause of death?
The autopsy painted a grim picture. It confirmed that Rachel had been sexually assaulted and that the cause of death was asphyxiation.
This is a truly horrific crime. And I'm sure at this point the investigators were feeling the pressure to find the person responsible. Who were the initial suspects? Did they have any leads to go on?
Well, given the location, with its homeless encampments, transient individuals quickly became a focus of the investigation.
Right.
The town's response, however, was quite controversial.
Really?
They implemented increased police patrols and focused heavily on arresting transients, even without any solid evidence directly linking them to Rachel's murder.
It seems like fear and a rush to judgment might have clouded their initial approach. Was there anyone else who caught their attention?
Yes, there was one name that kept surfacing during the investigation: Billy Fagan.
Okay, Billy Fagan. Who was he and what was his connection to Rachel?
Billy was a 17-year-old at the time who claimed to be beach friends with Rachel.
Okay.
He was very public about his connection to the case, giving interviews, and even making claims that he had found some of Rachel's discarded clothing. But as the investigation progressed, those claims turned out to be false.
It almost sounds like he was inserting himself into the narrative, trying to gain attention. Was there any evidence directly linking him to the crime scene?
Despite the attention and suspicion surrounding him, Billy was never officially charged in connection with Rachel's murder. He did, however, face a number of unrelated charges that further fueled public scrutiny.
Unrelated charges. What were those about?
Billy was facing multiple charges as an adult: assault, sexual battery, and a few others. Now remember, none of these were directly related to Rachel's case, but they certainly cast a shadow over him and intensified public suspicion.
So even though there wasn't a direct link to Rachel's murder, these other charges made him a person of interest.
Absolutely. And before we dive further into Billy Fagan and the complexities surrounding his involvement, it's important to remember the challenges faced by investigators at that time, particularly when it came to DNA testing.
Yes, DNA technology was still relatively new in 1990s. It wasn't the readily available tool it is today.
Exactly. And the pace of testing was incredibly slow, adding to the frustration of Rachel's family and the community desperately seeking answers.
So while they waited for those crucial DNA results, the investigation continued. What happened with the case against Billy Fagan? Did those unrelated charges lead to any breakthroughs?
Those unrelated charges against Billy Fagan, they really complicated things. It's a classic example of how public perception can sometimes influence the direction of an investigation.
And it's easy to see why people might have jumped to conclusions, given the serious nature of those charges. But it's important to remember they weren't related to Rachel's case. Did those charges ultimately hold up in court?
Well, that's where things took another turn. Despite the media frenzy and the weight of public opinion, the case against Billy began to unravel. Prosecutors had a difficult time getting witnesses to testify, and several girls who had been interviewed claimed they felt misled by investigators. It seemed the case was falling apart.
Wow. So what happened? Did the charges get dropped?
Eventually, Billy reached a plea deal. He pleaded no contest to 5 misdemeanor charges and agreed to attend counseling. The more serious charges were dropped.
So after all that, Billy Fagan was essentially removed from the picture as a suspect in Rachel's case. Where did the investigation go from there?
For a while, it seemed like they had hit a dead end. The case went cold for several years, with very little new information coming to light. It wasn't until 2004, when the Palm Beach County Sheriff's Office Cold Case Unit took over, that there was a significant break in the case.
2004, that's 14 years after Rachel's murder. What sparked that renewed interest in the case? Was it a new witness? A tip? Something like that?
It wasn't a tip or a witness, it was technology. Remember that bloody shirt found in your burn barrel?
Yeah.
Well, advancements in DNA technology allowed them to retest that shirt, and finally they got a match. The DNA pointed to a man named Douglas Gross.
Okay, so now we have a new suspect, Douglas Gross. Who was he, and what was his connection to Rachel's case?
Douglas Gross was 17 years old at the time of Rachel's murder, and he was known to frequent the wooded areas around Carlin Park where Rachel's body was found. More importantly, his DNA was already in the system because he was serving a 20-year sentence for a string of violent crimes unrelated to Rachel's murder.
So he had a history of violence. That certainly makes him a more compelling suspect than Billy Fagan. When confronted with the DNA evidence, did he confess to Rachel's murder?
He denied any involvement in the murder, claiming he was in juvenile detention at the time, making it impossible for him to have committed the crime.
An alibi, huh? Did the investigators look into that?
They did, and their findings created another layer of mystery. Records confirm that Douglas was indeed supposed to be in juvenile detention on the day of Rachel's murder. However, rumors began to surface that he may have escaped and then returned without anyone noticing.
So potentially another false alibi. That's quite a coincidence if both the main suspects in this case had flimsy alibis.
It certainly raises eyebrows, doesn't it? But investigators were never able to definitively prove that he had escaped from juvenile detention.
Did Douglas offer any other explanation for how his blood might have ended up on that shirt?
He did. He suggested that he may have given the shirt to someone else, or that the blood could have come from one of the many fights he was involved in at the beach encampments.
That seems like a stretch, to be honest. Giving your shirt away, especially a bloody one, doesn't sound very plausible.
It does seem like a desperate attempt to explain away incriminating evidence. And as the investigation into Douglas continued, there was another development that added fuel to the fire.
What happened? Did they uncover new evidence?
An inmate who was serving time with Douglas came forward with some potentially damning information. He claimed that Douglas had confessed to raping and killing Rachel.
A jailhouse confession? That's pretty compelling, but I also know those confessions can be tricky. They're not always reliable.
You're absolutely right. Inmate testimony needs to be treated with caution because there are often ulterior motives involved. Maybe they're trying to cut a deal, get a reduced sentence, or even just gain notoriety.
So even with the DNA match and the inmate's confession, they still didn't have enough to officially charge Douglas Gross with Rachel's murder.
That's right. And unfortunately, despite all the twists and turns, all the potential suspects, and all the advancements in DNA testing over the years, Rachel's murder remains unsolved.
That's incredibly frustrating. Were there any other individuals considered persons of interest during the investigation?
There were a few others who came up on their radar, including a notorious figure, serial killer Charlie Brandt.
A serial killer. That's chilling. Why was he considered a suspect in Rachel's case?
Charlie Brandt had ties to South Florida and a horrific history of violence against women. But his modus operandi, his typical pattern of behavior, didn't quite align with the evidence in Rachel's case.
How so? What made his crimes different?
Brandt was known for extreme brutality and mutilation, which wasn't consistent with the evidence found at Rachel's crime scene.
So investigators ultimately ruled him out as a suspect.
Yes, but the fact that a serial killer was even considered highlights just how complex and unsettling this case truly is.
It's a real head-scratcher. You have these two main figures, Billy Fagan and Douglas Gross, each with their own connections to the case, but neither with enough solid evidence to lead to an arrest. And then you have other potential suspects like Charlie Brandt lurking in the background. It's enough to make you wonder if we'll ever know for sure what happened to Rachel.
It really is. It's a case that highlights the intricacies of cold case investigations, how time can both help and hinder the search for truth. On one hand, advancements in technology like DNA analysis can provide crucial breakthroughs.
Right.
But on the other hand, memories fade, witnesses become harder to locate, and evidence can deteriorate.
Right.
It's a constant battle against time.
And in a case like this, where there are so many potential suspects, it must feel like trying to solve a puzzle where some of the pieces are missing. What are the investigators' current thoughts on the case? Do they have any leads that they're actively pursuing?
Detective Springer, who has been diligently working on this case for years, believes that everyone investigated remains a potential suspect until an arrest is made.
Okay.
He's open to any new information that might come to light.
So it's not a closed book.
No.
There's still hope that someone out there might have a piece of information, something they observed or heard that could break this case wide open.
Absolutely. Sometimes it's the smallest detail, a seemingly insignificant memory that someone has suppressed or dismissed that can make all the difference. Maybe someone listening right now remembers something, a conversation, a sighting, anything at all that seemed unimportant at the time, but could be the missing link in this investigation.
It's worth thinking about for sure. What stands out to you as the most puzzling aspect of this case? Is it the alibis? The DNA evidence? The sheer number of potential suspects? What's the biggest question mark for you?
The sheer number of potential suspects, coupled with the lack of a clear motive, makes this case incredibly perplexing. We have Billy Fagan, who inserts himself into the investigation, but is ultimately cleared by DNA evidence. And then you have Douglas Gross, with the DNA match on the bloody shirt, but an alibi that, while questionable, can't be entirely disproven. It's a tangled web of possibilities. And without a clear understanding of why Rachel's targeted, it's even harder to narrow down the possibilities.
And let's not forget those lingering questions about the initial stages of the investigation, the claims of mishandled evidence, and the intense focus on transients without any concrete evidence connecting them to the crime. It all adds layers of complexity and makes it even harder to separate fact from speculation.
It really highlights the importance of thorough and unbiased investigations, especially in cases as sensitive as this. Every decision, every piece of evidence can have a significant impact on the trajectory of the investigation and the pursuit of justice.
So what can our listeners do if they think they might have information about this case? Even if it seems small or insignificant, it could be the missing piece of the puzzle that the investigators need.
That's right. No detail is too small. Anyone with any information about Rachel Hurley's disappearance or murder should contact Detective William Springer at the Palm Beach County Sheriff's Office.
We'll be sure to include Detective Springer's contact information in the show notes for this episode. We can't let Rachel's story fade into obscurity. It's important to remember that even though years have passed, this case still deeply affects Rachel's family and the community. They deserve answers. They deserve justice.
I agree. And perhaps by keeping Rachel's story alive, by encouraging people to come forward with information, we can help bring some closure to this decades-old mystery.
It's a haunting case, a young life cut short, a family left with unanswered questions. We can only hope that someday the truth will come to light and someone will be held accountable for this terrible crime.
Before we wrap up, there's one final thought I'd like to leave you with. We've discussed Billy Fagan and Douglas Gross, each connected to the case in their own way. But what if there's a connection between them that we haven't considered?
Ooh, that's an interesting angle. A connection between Billy Fagan and Douglas Gross? Now, that's a theory worth exploring. Maybe someone out there knows something that could link those two seemingly separate threads of the investigation. Perhaps that's the key to finally understanding what happened to Rachel Hurley.
It's certainly possible. Maybe there's a piece of information out there that could connect those dots and finally bring justice for Rachel. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into this incredibly complex and heartbreaking case. Let's hope that someday Rachel's family will get the answers they deserve.